Seeing some of the examples of how this virus has got away from governments, whether it be Brazil or elsewhere, the United States, it's a reminder that our current second wave of challenges, while it is significant, is, we're still in a comparatively good position, Greg.
Yeah, that's true, Kieran. That's absolutely true. What is distinct about our position, though, is that we had conquered the matter, and then entirely as a consequence of monumental failure and incompetence by the Victorian state government of Daniel Andrews, we've produced a second crisis for ourselves. And living as I do here in the plague state, I am struck at the failure of our political culture, because what you've got in state governments now is a complete failure of democratic scrutiny and accountability. Andrews has set up an inquiry into the quarantine hotel fiasco. That means he doesn't have to answer any questions about it. Victorian Parliament is not sitting. The ABC doesn't have any state-based TV current affairs. Andrews is a democratic lawful politician, but it's like you're living in some sort of Latin American dictatorship here. The leader comes on the TV every day and tells you what's what, doesn't address any meaningful questions, and there are no political consequences. And one consequence of having no accountability, no mechanism of scrutiny, is that you get these shocking mistakes by governments. And he just refers it to an inquiry and says, well, nothing to see here, move on. So our crisis is still less than other nations, but it's entirely self-inflicted.
When you look at the electoral timetable, obviously, I think it's 2022 from memory is the next state election. But one would think that, the political fortunes of Daniel Andrews are going to cop it in the wake of this, debacle, to be frank, around the quarantining.
You would surely think so. But I am very concerned about our political culture. I think the ABC has let the nation down by not having state-based 7:30 report. All of our state jurisdictions no longer have any effective scrutiny. Why is the Victorian Parliament not sitting? There is no health reason for the Victorian Parliament not to sit. The Andrews government decided to prevent the Victorian Public Accounts Committee from looking into the hotel fiasco and won't answer a single question on the matter. Charlie Cook, the US political consultant, told me once that he thought voters had an absolute memory of about 12 to 18 months. So, they'd have to the crisis would have to still be having its big effect at the next state election for Andrews to suffer a proper democratic accountability. But how is it that no state government minister has resigned? We don't even really know which state government minister was responsible for this hotels fiasco, because the Andrews government won't answer the most elementary question about it, just refers everything onto the inquiry. The federal government has legitimate reason not to lambaste the Andrews government at the moment, because everybody wants to cooperate. But I'm very concerned as an Australian, as a journalist, political journalist, I'm very concerned there is a breakdown in the democratic culture in Australia at state level, and the lack of accountability and scrutiny produces just these staggering mess-ups like you got with the Andrews government.
Greg, let's look further afield now, and the Prime Minister's going to be holding talks tomorrow with Shinzo Abe of Japan. Obviously, coronavirus is an issue they'll be managing, but one thing I wanted to get your reflections on is the fact that, the Japanese under Abe have started an improvement in ties with Beijing. They've had much more severe schisms than we've had, and yet they're back on an even keel. Are there things that Prime Minister Morrison should be discussing, trying to see how the Japanese have done it in terms of what is also a very important trading partner with Japan, but they've got much more serious problems, including territorial disputes that they've got to manage as well as or alongside their trading and economic relationship, Greg?
Well, Kieran, I think you're absolutely right. The relationship that China has with all of its partners has many seasons, many ups and downs. The Morrison government would say, and I think they'd be justified in saying, they have not sought at any point to make relations with Beijing worse. They've responded as they've had to do to things which Beijing has done. I mean, it was Beijing who withheld information about the coronavirus at the start, which resulted in the world having a much worse crisis than would otherwise have been the case. It's Beijing which in this massive political interference and cyber espionage against Australia and was the author of all those recent cyber attacks to which Australia has to respond. And now the travel advice from the government is very sensible. If you travel to China and speak in an untoward fashion, you are, or even if they just decide to take a hostage, as they've done many times, you are subject to arbitrary arrest. Now, this is a terrible situation, extremely perplexing for Australia to be in these terms with its biggest economic partner. But the fact that another country like Japan has a moment of goodness in its relationship, nobody is more clear-eyed than Shinzo Abe about what's going on in Beijing. But all countries, Japan like Australia, try to have as good a relationship with Beijing as they can. And Beijing itself doesn't like to wage a war on all fronts simultaneously. So occasionally it picks someone out for favour, just as occasionally it picks someone out for punishment. I mean, a couple of months ago, India and China were having a good moment in their relationship, but then China just decided to march across their border and steal a good bit of their territory in Ladakh and kill quite a few of their soldiers. So there's nothing in Abe's momentary good, passage with Beijing which rebukes us. But of course, I know that Morrison is engaged very deeply in dialogue with Abe, as he is with Narendra Modi, the South Koreans, the Malaysians, the Indonesians, the Vietnamese, the Singaporeans especially, about how we respond to China, whose behaviour over the past 6 months has been so consistently unreasonable.